Welcome to the new year. In this video, you're going to learn 5 areas in your worship ministry that you need to reevaluate as you step into this coming year. Coming up. Hey there, my name is Spencer Cormany from leadingworshipwell.com, your daily dose of practical worship leading tips. If you want to find those tips, head over to Instagram or Facebook at Leading Worship Well, where I'm posting new worship leading tips every single day. But you're here on YouTube, so go ahead, hit the subscribe button down below, and let's get into it, because today we're talking about the new year. And the new year is finally here, and it's the perfect time to step into something new, but it's also a good time to sort of take a little step back and just get an overview of our worship ministries and see what happened in this past year. We want to see what worked and what didn't work, and ultimately we want to identify what we can improve this coming year. So I've identified these 5 areas that I think that you need to reevaluate in your worship ministry, because these areas are really important. So let's get into it. The first area that you need to reevaluate as we step into the new year are your worship rehearsals. And maybe you don't even have worship rehearsals. And I understand that some people have portable campuses and you don't have a space to set up in throughout the week, but I really believe that worship rehearsals are so important. So right off the bat, if you don't have regular worship rehearsals, and I'm talking like throughout the week, not just a quick run through on Sunday mornings, if you don't have a regular rehearsal during the week, or maybe if you're like a portable campus, if you could just find one time a month to just meet outside of a Sunday morning, I think it would be so beneficial for you. So reevaluate that area if you don't have a rehearsal at all. But if you do have a rehearsal, there's a couple things that you should be evaluating in that and seeing what you can improve for this coming year. And one of those areas is, how are you doing those rehearsals? Like, what is your structure in your rehearsal? Do you have a structure, or are you just kind of showing up and doing whatever? Or maybe you have a structure and it's worked in this past year, but you need to sort of update it in this new year because you realized that your worship team grew over this past year, and maybe some piece that you had in that worship rehearsal wasn't necessary anymore. I remember I did this with my worship team this past year. I realized that whenever we first started out, we had some new people in the worship team, and so we met like a half an hour before we actually went up on stage, and we ran through the songs to give people extra time to learn their parts and just get more comfortable leading with the rest of the band. But in this past year, I realized the people on the worship team, like they're ready now, so we don't need that extra 30 minutes because they already know what they're doing. So we can just meet for a little bit and then move up on stage. So that's sort of an idea of, okay, our worship team is evolving, so our worship rehearsal time can evolve as well. If you want an idea of what I think that you should do in your worship rehearsals, you can check out this video right here. In that video, I run through my complete process of how I view worship rehearsals, and I give you 5 things, the 5 main essential things that I think a worship rehearsal should include, so that you can lead your team in growing their relationships, in growing their musicianship, and in growing spiritually. So check that video out and consider, reevaluate, do I have all those 5 pieces that I mentioned in that video? And if I don't, should I add them this year? The second area you should reevaluate this coming year is your song list, like your repertoire of, I love that word, repertoire, your repertoire of worship songs. What songs are you singing at your church? And maybe you have, maybe not enough. Maybe you need to add some more this year, or maybe you're like a lot of us who have way too many, and you've got like 150 songs, and you're constantly teaching your church new songs, and they don't really know what they're singing. So maybe you need to minimize that list so that people can sing better and connect more because they actually know the songs that they're singing. But the other piece of that is thematically too. Like, what are the themes in your worship repertoire? Do you cover the main things that you need to cover? Do you cover the gospel? First of all, do you cover confession? Do you cover all of these things that are important for us to keep in front of our church? Because if you have holes in your theology, in your singing. People learn theology through singing. That's one of the reasons that we sing in churches, so that people learn theology. And if you're missing holes in your worship repertoire of theology, then your church isn't going to have a complete picture of God. So just sort of consider, what am I teaching my church through the songs that I have planned for this coming year? And then the other part of that is, maybe there's songs that were really important to you in this past season and this past year, or maybe for the past 2 years, but reevaluate those. Go through your song list and say, is this song still as relevant to the people in my church as it was 2 years ago? And maybe the answer is yes, and you should keep doing it, but maybe the answer is no, and it's like, okay, we've moved past that season in our church and it's time to move on to something new. And then from there, you can start identifying new songs that you want to teach your church that fill in those holes in the theology of your worship repertoire, and also allow them to respond to the current season that they're in. The third area to reevaluate this coming year are your worship leading systems. So a worship leading system are the things that you've set in place beforehand that make what you do easier. So there are a bunch of different systems. One of them could be something like how you set things up for Sunday morning. What's your system for that? Who's creating slides? How are you planning your set lists? If you're just kind of flying by the seat of your pants every single week and you're always doing things differently, that adds so much more time to your preparation, and unnecessary time. It's just really a lack of planning before you prepare. But whenever you plan a system and you say, okay, on Tuesdays, I'm showing up, I'm putting all the lyrics into ProPresenter or PowerPoint or whatever you're using to run lyrics. You do it that day, and then you've got this other list of stuff that you do, and you just build this system, and then next time you come in, you can just be on autopilot and you're plugging everything into the system which you've already created in advance, and it saves so much time. So that's an example of a worship leading system. Another one could be how you incorporate people into your team. If you have new people, how are you training them to lead worship? Do you have a system for that? Or are you just like, hey, come lead with us on Sunday morning? If you can set these systems up in advance, then when the busy seasons hit, like we just got over with Christmas, if you had the proper systems in place during that busy season, it was a lot easier for you because you didn't have to make all these extra decisions during those busy periods because you already knew what you were going to do. And the same is true for the rest of the year. The more systems you can set up in your worship ministry, the easier it will be to just have these things in place, and you can do them and you don't have to think about them. So what system can you create this year? You don't have to make a million. There's probably like 20 systems that you could create, but if you could just commit to creating one new system that would help you lead tomorrow, we're thinking forward, we're being prudent, acting with care and thought of the future. If you can just do that, that's going to help you so much whenever you actually get to the point that you need that system in place. The fourth area to reevaluate in this coming year is to ask yourself the question, who can I ask to join my worship team? The number one thing that I hear from worship leaders whenever it comes to their worship team is, how do I grow my worship team? And oftentimes the answer is just ask people. I know it sounds crazy, and I know a lot of you lead in different sized churches. Some of you lead in large churches. Some of you lead in small churches. But I truly believe that no matter what size church you're in, unless it's like a group of 5 people, there is somebody in your church who can help you lead worship. There is somebody in your church right now who is sitting there who has musical ability, and your job, if you want to grow your worship team, is to find them. 95% of the time, they aren't going to come up to you and ask. In fact, most of the time, and I'll just say this honestly, most of the time, the people who come up to you and they've been coming to church for like 2 weeks, and they're like, hey, I'm really good at musically, I want to lead worship with you on Sunday. Those aren't usually the people that you want to join your worship team. Usually they're going to create problems in the future. But the person who's sitting in the background, and maybe they just sit in their bedroom and play guitar all day, but they never really told anybody about it because they're afraid and they're humble. That's part of humility. But your job is to go find those people. And there is somebody in your church who's waiting to be asked to help lead worship. And maybe they don't even know that that's something that could be on the horizon. But as you form relationships with the people in your church, you start to identify these people that you can ask to join and help you lead worship. And that leads into the fifth and final area that you need to reevaluate this year, and that is asking the question, how are you replacing yourself? As a worship leader, how are you replacing yourself so that, number one, when you're gone, because you aren't going to be able to lead worship forever, who's picking up the slack behind you? Whenever you're not leading worship anymore, what's going to happen to your worship ministry? This is something that's a long-term thing. It goes even past this coming year, but you want to be thinking about it right now because that's the long term. But the short term is, how are you replacing yourself where you don't have to lead every single Sunday? Because if you can implement a regular routine of rest this year, that is probably the most beneficial thing that you can do. Sometimes the most beneficial thing that you can do is to simply do nothing for a little bit. But if you don't have somebody who can cover your responsibilities, then I know how it is. You feel like you have to be there every single Sunday, leading week in and week out, and maybe you've done that for the past 3 years and you're exhausted. So how are you replacing yourself? It goes back to what I talked about before in the last point, and that's that you should be asking people to join your worship team. If you're the only one leading worship in your church, you should be going out and finding people who can help you lead worship. And maybe they aren't ready to share the responsibility of leading worship with you yet, but in a year, in 2 years, they might be there as you continue to develop them. So that's one way to replace yourself. But if you have people already on your worship team and there's a background vocalist, give them a chance to lead a song some Sunday. Lead them in that process of preparing to do that and disciple them in leading worship, because one day they can lead worship all by themselves and you don't even need to be there, which allows you time to rest. So how are you replacing yourself this coming year? Well, that's it for this video. Before you go, though, speaking of the new year, I put together a free resource for you that helps you plan for this coming year. It's called 5 Questions You Need to Answer to Crush Your 2020 Worship Leading Goals. In this free worksheet, I just take you through the process of setting your goals for 2020, but also celebrating what happened this past year, because that's important too. And I even show you how to include your worship team in that process. So if you're interested in getting that free worksheet, the link's in the description down below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me today. Once again, my name's Spencer Cormany from leadingworshipwell.com. I hope you have an amazing new year. Keep leading worship well.